All right. If you have not already, be making your way in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 6. And that's where we're going to pick up in our study of the book of 1 Kings. Of course, at this point in time, we saw in chapter 5 that basically Solomon has rest from all of his enemies, at least for a brief time period, and that's basically what will set in motion the opportunity for Solomon to build the temple, which happens in chapter 6. If you would make a mark there, and then also mark in your Bible 2 Peter chapter 1. We're going to kind of draw some parallels, some parallels that I think of when I think about the construction of the temple. A lot of what you read about in chapter 6 of 1 Kings doesn't have a whole lot of because a lot of it's just details about the structure of the temple, which hopefully next week I'll have a series of pictures of how artists have drawn up in their idea about the outline of the temple based on what you have there in 1 Kings chapter 6. So we'll try to look at that next week. But we'll make some connections between 1 Kings chapter 6 and 2 Peter chapter 1. So the plan, I guess, for today is to try to get down through verse 14, and then we'll come back and maybe look at some pictures of the actual temple next week. There'll be a couple things that we point out too that might be of interest to us as it connects to perhaps not just the Old Testament, but not just the Old Testament, some connections to the Old Testament law, that is. All right, so 1 Kings chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, says that it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. This verse is actually very important. Not because of necessarily what it teaches, but because of what it states. You notice there that it says that it was the 480th year, so 480 years after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt. Typically, the closer that you get to the present, the easier it becomes to date things. And that's not necessarily true in American history per se, as much as it's true in times of antiquity. Typically, it becomes a lot easier for archaeologists and people who study the history of antiquity. It becomes easier for them to kind of put dates on things when you get closer to the present. And sometimes that's because, in a lot of cases, that's because you have a lot more artifacts. The closer that you get to recent history, the more evidence that you have of that time period. So, for instance, what happened in the 1960s, we got a ton of evidence about what happens in the 1960s that people have written about. But 2000 BC, well, there's not nearly as much evidence that's around. So, there are a lot of things that historians will use to, or at least Bible historians will use to try to date certain events in the Bible. And recently there's been actually a lot of evidence that has helped prove that David was indeed a real person. And that was because of an inscription made that comes from, I want to say, may have been an Assyrian artifact that references the house of David. There are also coins and things like that archaeologists have found. But the reason why I bring all that up is because historians of antiquity, have been able to kind of date when Solomon's reign as king began, which was somewhere around 974 to 980 BC. And they've been able to do that because of various artifacts that they found. So if you're able to date Solomon's reign as king based on verse 1, this is how people, when it comes to, how many years has man existed, how many years has the world existed, this is one of those verses that people can look to and help get an idea and put years behind certain events. So if we know that Solomon was king around somewhere in the neighborhood of 980 BC, what that tells us is that 480 years beforehand, we can set in stone that that's the date where Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, which corresponds to around, I believe if my math is correct, somewhere around 1400 BC to 1450 BC. So that may be something that you don't pick up on. That verse is actually really important when it comes to how people date the Bible, because we have at least a decent idea about when Solomon was king, and we can use the timestamp given in verse 1 to try to figure out, at least what the date was when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt. All right, so verse 2. Now the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. The vestibule in front of the sanctuary of the house was 20 cubits long across the width of the house, and the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house. And he made for the house windows with leveled frames. Now, we'll look at pictures of this next week, but one writer just simply said that this building looked like a really big rectangle. The cubits, typically a measure of a cubit was typically from the tip of the middle finger down to the elbow, which was not an exact measurement, but historians kind of put a cubit measuring somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 foot 9 inches. So if that's the case, we kind of have an idea about how large the house in verse 2 is. So if it's 60 cubits, that corresponds to, from my understanding, about 36 yards. So 36 yards in length. Whereas you compare that with the width, with it being 20, that's about 12 yards. Its height, 30 cubits, which would be around 18 yards. So a fairly large structure, not as big as a football field, and that's just the house too. You're not talking about the outer portion of the temple as well. So it says in verse 4 that he made for the house windows with leveled frames. And obviously in buildings in that time period, it's really important to have windows. You don't have any type of indoor heating or indoor air, so you need air circulation as well. And, obviously we can kind of understand that. In the South, we like to have air conditioning. If we don't have air conditioning, beforehand, you're going to have your windows open even if it's really hot outside. You need air circulation. I was talking to my students about this we were talking about how people lived in cities in the early 1900s before they had air conditioning. And we were talking about kind of what they did with their free time. And what they did with their free time is that they went outside and did things. They didn't typically stay inside and read a book, or really reading a book's your only other option because you don't have any of the modern technology now. And that's because you stay inside in the city where you have very little air circulation in some of those large buildings. It's very uncomfortable. So you need windows to make things a little bit comfortable. And obviously when we talk about in the temple, you've got the priests that are working in there. And so, you need some level of circulation. That, including with all the animals that you're going to have in there that are going to be slaughtered. And so really important to have windows. Against the wall of the temple, he built chambers all around. Against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary. Thus, he made side chambers all around it. The lowest chamber was 5 cubits wide, the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For he made narrow ledges around the outside of the temple, so that the support beams would not be fastened into the walls of the temple. All right, so why is it necessary to have these chambers around the temple?
Maybe storage.
Yeah, if you think about it, you got to have storage, right? You've got all the different items used in the temple. You've obviously got certain provisions that are kept there in the temple. You've got all those animals that are going to be sacrificed. You need all of those. You need all of those chambers. Do we remember what famous king was hidden in the temple? It wasn't Josiah. It starts with a J. There's a lot of kings that's Joash. Give me a minute. I'm trying to pull up. We remember the story of Joash, do we not? How his grandmother sought to kill him. Well, let's look at it. 2 Kings chapter 11. Just as a reminder for us, these are some things that we could point out. Obviously, within these chambers, there's a lot of space there in the temple. There are different rooms. And so, we might remember 2 Kings chapter 11 that Athaliah comes and basically her son dies. She tries to take the throne and she wants to keep the throne for herself. And the end result of that is she goes and tries to kill basically all of her grandchildren, with the exception of Joash. And notice in verse 4, where did Jehoiada the priest take Joash? And had them come to him in the house of the Lord. And that's where they're going to hide, and that's where they hide Joash, there in the house of the Lord. One, because it's such a big building, you have all those chambers that it's possible to be able to do that. And of course, we know that the end result for Athaliah is that she is ultimately, killed for her treason against Israel. We might recall that later on, when the Israelites returned from captivity, I can't remember his name right offhand, but there was a man that was hiding in the chambers, basically was living in one of the chambers of the temple. And the people of Israel were responsible for essentially taking that man and throwing him out because he was an immoral person living in the house of God. And that's another example of where, it's another story where we see the concept of the chamber of the temples come into play. But those chambers are there mainly for storage, because you kind of need all that space for to carry out all the work that was involved in the temple. So, verse 7, the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. Now, this references to this also. The verse 7 also can reference to how altars were constructed, at least according to the law of Moses, right? Because within the temple, right, we have several altars, right? You've got one on the outer court of the temple. You have one on the inner court, or in the inside of the temple. Obviously, when we talk about the sacrifices made for the forgiveness of sins, those sacrifices were made upon an altar. So, when you talk about the construction inside the temple, you're not just talking about the temple frame, but also the things in the temple, building an altar. And so, look for a moment at Exodus chapter 20, verses 22 through 26. Exodus chapter 20, verses 22 through 26. God gave Moses and the Israelites specific laws about how he wanted altars to be constructed. In verse 22, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you." That would also include within the temple, right? because that's part of what the temple was for. Notice verse 25, that if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones. If you got another translation, what do you have translated there for the word hewn? You got cut. Yeah, so you shall not build it of cut stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it. So, particularly what I wanted to point out was verse 25. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn or cut stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. Now, why do you think God might have put in place that idea? Because what he's saying there is you're not going to take stones and then basically cut it up and round it off. You're going to basically take it as you find it and use that stone to build the altar. Why do you think God desired for Israel to do it that, or to carry it out that way?
To keep them from making idols with the stone, to worship the stone rather than what the stone was used for.
Right. I think that's a very good point. I think we can draw two things out of that. One, the point of the offering of burnt sacrifices, right? That whole process, that was not about making the altar look as pretty as possible, right? Because that was an old idea that a lot of those Canaanite nations had. Basically, the better that something looked, the more that the gods will be pleased. That's a common thing that applied to their sacrifices as well. Again, that was why within those Canaanite nations, sometimes that they offered child sacrifice, because they were of the mindset the more that you sacrifice, the more that your gods will be pleased with you. And that's part of the point that we can draw out here, is the Israelites are not supposed to look at the altar and say, like, make it look really nice and focus all their attention on looking and making it look as nice as possible, rather than forget the actual meaning of the sacrifice. We could liken it in some ways to taking care of the building, right? And obviously, you do want to take care of your building, but you can have the nicest, most expensive church building. I know that there are a lot of church buildings that people will travel to visit because they're very old. They're sometimes made out of stone, and they look really nice. You can go through Tupelo, right? And some of those churches down there in downtown Tupelo, they look really nice in how they've been constructed and everything. But the point is not how nice the building is constructed, but what's going on inside the building. And in this particular case, specifically with the altar, that's part of the idea here that God has in mind. If you focus on taking and cutting stone and making it as nice as possible, you're almost to the point, as Brother George was saying, is you're worshiping the altar rather than recognizing its importance when it comes to the offering of forgiveness. So that's one thing. And then number two, in my mind, right, if you think about it in the sense that God created nature, those stones that are unhewed or uncut, those are the stones that God made, right? So, in my mind, that also kind of plays a role in it. The point, as it connects to Exodus chapter 20 and 1 Kings chapter 6, is that in verse 7, when it says that the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer, door, or chisel, or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. Part of that's going to connect to the idea of how the altar was constructed. And that was not... And while the temple itself obviously would be constructed with stones from the quarry, when it came to the altars within the temple, those were not going to be constructed of stone that had been cut in the same manner. So anyway, that's something to point out. Verse 8, the doorway for the middle story was on the right side of the temple. They went up by stairs to the middle story, and from the middle to the third. So he built the temple and finished it, and he paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar. And he built side chambers against the entire temple, each 5 cubits high. They were attached to the temple with cedar beams. Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, Concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David, and I will dwell among the people of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. So Solomon built the temple and finished it. And next week we'll talk more about the details of sort of the inside of the temple. But for the rest of our time, I want us to look at 2 Peter chapter 1 for a few moments. Because I think about what God had just told Solomon when he talked about the construction of the temple, that if you walk in my commandments, the understanding is not just that God would be with Solomon and the Israelites, but it would also be of the understanding that the temple would remain, right? Because that's where God's dwelling place was. That's why we understand when the Babylonians come to destroy Judah, several hundred years later, the temple's destroyed as well. It was a sign of God's displeasure with them. Now, we noticed, of course, that the temple in the New Testament a lot of times is a reference to the Christian, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 6, other passages as well, it references the church. I think about what Peter wrote in 2 Peter chapter 1 because I think about how that parallels basically with what God had told Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 6. So let's look at 2 Peter chapter 1, where Peter is, of course, writing to Christians. And he says in verse 2, Grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, as his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him that called us by glory and virtue, by which have given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Now here I think about the construction of the temple, all the elements needed to completely build it. I think about 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse 5, where God basically lists, through the Apostle Peter, God basically lists characteristics that Christians need to work on to build themselves up to be what God expects them to be. So, we are partakers of the divine nature, a reference to our salvation. We've escaped the corruption in the world. So then, verse 5, what do? You keep building on that foundation. Verse 5, but also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. I think about all those traits that are mentioned here. I think about all the materials that are going to be used to build the temple. The cedar trees, the stones from the quarry, the gold that's going to be overlaid on some of the objects within the temple. All of those precious things that God required in the building of the temple, or at least that Solomon felt was important to include in the temple. But God's also very clear. If we think about ourselves as the church, at least individually, we have to continue to build upon the foundation that had been established when we obeyed the gospel. And that's what Peter's saying. If you want to continue to be a partaker of the divine nature, if you want to continue to be right with God, you have to continue to build on these qualities, these different materials, spiritually speaking, that will make sure that you are firm in what you have built. So verse 8, for if these things are yours and abound, you will be neither barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. For he who lacks these things is short-sighted, even to blindness, and has forgotten that he was cleansed from his old sins. Therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure, for if you do these things, you will never stumble. Now, I really think about that verse. I think about verse 10. I really think about how it connects back to 1 Kings 6, verses 11 through 14, with the comparison of Solomon. Because that was the promise given to Solomon. You do what I say of you, you will prosper, your people will prosper, and the temple itself will stay in existence. You won't have to worry about God departing Israel because his dwelling place will always be there if you do what he says. What's the parallel to the temple of the New Testament, the church? Therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. Remember that Peter is writing to Christians, people that, much like Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 6, they're doing everything that God expects of them. They're doing everything right. And so, in light of that, you have to keep doing right. For if you do these things, you will never stumble. Of course, that word "if" is very important. If you do these things, you will never stumble. If you build on those qualities, you won't have to worry about losing your salvation. You won't fall to the problem of sin. For Solomon, he didn't keep his end of the bargain in 1 Kings chapter 6. That's why ultimately, the end of his reign, very problematic. His descendants, things are going to get very problematic because of, again, the split in the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel having all wicked kings, and their rebellion against God and the worship that was to be taking place in the temple. That happened because they did not continue in what God said, and Peter is very clear. If you do not continue in what God says, the conditional promise is, then you will stumble, spiritually speaking. And that's a position that nobody wants to be in. With that being said, are there any thoughts that you'd like to add on to 2 Peter chapter 1?
Going back to the building of the temple for a moment, people have often wondered how the Egyptians built pyramids. Those stones weighing tons and tons, and getting those up in elevation, and how they were able to do that. Just a great amount of ingenuity and brilliance. But then you go back to the temple being built with the stones prepared off-site, and they bring them together and they fit perfectly. I mean, that and all by hand. We're talking about no diamond cutting blades to cut stone or anything like that. We're talking hand work, and how obviously talented these people had to have been. And it just makes me a little envious that I don't have that talent. But I mean, just the ability to do that is, to me, astounding.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you don't have calculators or anything like that to do the math, to do all the measurements, right? The tools that they had, not nearly as sophisticated as the tools that we have today, and it is a very impressive thing. It also points to the fact about how well prepared they had to be able to do this. When it comes to making out this plan to building the temple, again, it required a lot of help, but it also required a lot of planning. Obviously, the people, like as Brother Wayne is mentioning, the people that are going to cut the stone and responsible for, getting everything to fit perfectly within the structure, that takes a lot of planning out. I think about how that can also parallel to the church as well. If you think about 2 Peter chapter 1, those qualities that Peter mentioned, those are qualities that are not easy to build on, right? Those are things that take a lot of patience, that take a lot of work. Again, you think about the concept of self-control in particular, and you can look at any of these, but I think about the concept of self-control in particular, right? The ability to be able to stop yourself from doing what you want to do. Very hard to do. Because a lot of the things that we want to do are either pleasant for us, they're easy for us, and that's something that we feel like we want to pursue. But the ability to learn how to keep yourself from just giving in to whatever impulses that you want is very, very hard to do. We at school, the teachers have a huge. We have like this. What will we call it? Just like this basket of candy we keep in one of the teachers' rooms. So when all the students leave, at the end of the day, we typically will go in there and work and sometimes eat candy. And for me, very hard to exercise self-control in that situation because I like chocolate and I'll get 2-3 pieces, maybe 4 or 5, depending on how tough the day was. But the point is, in that situation, it's kind of hard for me to show self-control or self-restraint in that situation. It's something that I have to work on, and it takes a lot of work to do that. So we might could think about how there's a similar idea between how much work went in the temple and how much preparation, and how you had to get your mind right to be able to get everything to fit perfectly. The same thing as it applies to the church as well. It takes a lot of work to be what we need to be as Christians. Brother George?
Also, to me, it points out the situation, the parallel of denominational. You can, in all good conscience, do what you think is right in the foundation of being baptized and so forth. But then if you don't continue in this building, when you look and see what's being taught,
Right.
you've got to apply that. You've got to have the diligence to pursue God's word,
Right.
to find out the truth and to start worshiping in truth.
Right.
And you don't find that where you're at in a denomination.
Right. I think we could point out here that when they built the temple, they didn't cut corners to make it easier. You know, they could. I mean, you could cut corners if you wanted to make things easier, but that's not how they went about it. You know, in some cases, we might think about it in that situation. You know, because there's some religious ideas that are a lot easier to accept. Right. If I don't have to be faithful for the rest of my life, that's an easier idea to accept that I need to be faithful for. You know, that my responsibility as a Christian is to be faithful unto death. It's a lot easier to accept that I don't have to be faithful unto death, but that would be cutting a corner around Christianity. And we could draw that parallel here. They don't cut corners when making the temple. And so spiritually speaking, as the church, when it comes to the things that we teach, we can't cut corners as well because maybe it's easier to do. All right, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here. We're already at 9:40, so we'll pick up in verse 15 next week. But thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning.